Hello and welcome to this video on how viruses are transmitted between humans. While we will focus on humans, many of the same principles apply to other species and between species. With COVID-19 in the forefront of everyone's mind recently, many people have argued about how dangerous it is and how many people it really can infect. This is used as a crutch for arguments against lockdowns and other similar public health measures. The question has been whether or not they work as infections keep rising. Understanding not only how a virus like COVID-19 infects people, but also the way it spreads will hopefully address some of the issues that are often misunderstood when arguing the issues at hand. Like nearly all viruses, COVID-19 needs to be carried from one person to another person. In this case, it is in the form of respiratory droplets. Small amounts of fluid filled with the virus. In other instances, such as HIV, it could be in any bodily fluid that enters the body of a new host. Droplets have more virus than the air you breathe out. These droplets are the most prevalent when someone sneezes, coughs, and even talks. The closer you are to the person, the more likely you are to inhale the droplets. The risk rises with proximity as the droplets weigh more than the virus in the air you breathe out. This means it disperses and falls out of the air quicker. The further you are from the person with COVID-19, the concentration of these droplets decreases. Larger droplets fall out of the air sooner due to gravity. Smaller droplets and particles spread apart in the air. These can remain suspended for far longer. The respiratory droplets travel to a new host. The virus then makes contact with mucous membranes. These can be found in the nasal cavity, eyes, and respiratory system when it comes to most exposure pathways. The deposition of these droplets introduces a large number of virus particles. Some infections can be spread by exposure to the virus in small droplets and particles that linger in the air for minutes to hours. These viruses may be able to infect people who are more than 6 feet apart from the person who is infected, or after that person has left the space. Infection can also come from more intimate contact. More or less any bodily fluid, so long as it has access to a mucous membrane. The virus particles arrive into these mucous membranes and other locations, and infection is facilitated by a receptor on these cells. This receptor is known as ACE2. It's a protein, and it's found on many cell types. Its role in the body and why it's so prevalent is that it creates another product from something called angiotensin. This is involved in regulation of blood pressure. As you can imagine, that has a large role to play right across the human body, and as a result, it has a number of functions to play in many different cells. The spike proteins on the COVID-19 virus are able to bond to the ACE2 receptor, kind of like a key into a lock, very specific locks, and by doing this they can hijack entry into the cell. This means there's no activation of the immune system based on this activity at this point in time. Having opened the door, the virus can enter and infect its first new host in its new possible carrier. ACE2 is present in many cell types. The ones that will be most important for the people we talk about in this video are the lungs, heart, blood vessels, liver, GI tract, and epithelial cells. The last of these are more prevalent in mucous membranes where they create barriers, and particularly they create mucus. Once you're infected with the virus, and the cells have to do something about it, well, they do to an extent. Unfortunately, it's exactly the opposite of what you want. The virus integrates itself into the cell DNA where the cell begins to replicate it. The viral RNA builds up in the cell, and eventually the cell is lysed. This releases the viral contents. It creates a sort of cascade of new cells being infected, and this in turn infects more cells. This destruction of the infected cells and release of viral material creates a supply of viruses and damaged cell in the mucous membranes especially. Don't forget though, it can cause damage to the heart and lungs. This damage in the membranes causes an immune response. Part of this response is inflammation. The inflammation pathway being activated in this case causes an increase to mucus production. Mucus does several things. The first is that it is a physical barrier. The virus gets caught in the mucus. This reduces the number of cells being infected. It is also full of antibodies. These attach to the virus particle and help the immune system to attack. Mucus also has another effect. It's used to remove the virus from the body. When you have the common cold or influenza, your nose will run. You have phlegm in your throat, and sinuses are clogged. These are all signs of the mucus working at an increased rate. Your nose is fundamentally one giant mucous membrane. It secretes mucus, which leads to your runny nose. Phlegm is the foreign material being caught in your respiratory pathway and working its way out. Your sinuses are similarly active, but because there's something getting in the way and getting caught in the mucus, they become clogged and blocked. This is where coughing comes in. It is the mechanical way to remove mucus. Cilia in the respiratory pathway are tiny projections on the cells. These have a wave-like motion which pushes the mucus up the respiratory pathway. This normally carries foreign matter or pathogens up to the epiglottis and is then transported down the esophagus and into the stomach, where stomach acid destroys it. When it reaches a great enough volume, or you get coughing physically forces material out of the mouth, rather than through the esophagus. The downside to this method is made very apparent with COVID-19. You are now expelling the virus and beginning the cycle of infection again. Remembering, what's in that mucus is a combination of damaged cells, foreign material that's being breathed in, and the virus particles. Virus particles caught and suspended in mucus. This eventually leads to someone else becoming infected, and this is where we need to talk about the rate of infection. It's a big part of what people don't understand. This is sometimes known as the R value. The R value is at the simplest a very basic description of how many people one person will infect. If an R value of 1 is achieved, then the disease will spread very slowly. Anything above 1 leads to an increase that's far greater. Below 1 is much slower. It is the growth rate, but somewhat different as it describes the spread rather than the increase in case count. The current R value is between 2 and 3 based on the original COVID-19 strain. Based on estimates of the UK and South African strains, there could be an R value of up to 5. Some estimates are even higher at an R value of 7 or more. These values are often not distributed out over a wide population, but instead they show up in clusters. That is, one person will infect a small group of other people in a very narrow geographical region, area, or associated with a one-off event. The fact that it often involves one event and one person infecting others is why the R value does not necessarily describe the increase in case count, but rather the way it is spreading. This one-off event or person is known as the index case or cluster, and the fact is it can be controlled, and where restrictions we see come into play, these controls are effective. Think about what happens when you have few or no opportunities to create clusters because social gatherings are not happening. This is why we see a limited outbreak in countries that have the spread under control. The general approach has been create the minimum possible number of events where spreading the disease could happen, decrease the possible number of exposure events that could lead to an outbreak. Limiting outbreaks to a small area allows for the cases to be tracked back to 1 or 2 original infections. It allows people to be followed up and identified. You can figure out if we had someone in this shopping center at this time, notify everybody who was there at that time that they could have picked up the disease, and it means you can fence in and control the spread that much quicker. The outbreak affects only a few people this way before authorities identify who is infected and control the outbreak. Taiwan, New Zealand, and Australia are good examples of this. The reason we are pushing this particular point is that the chances of another outbreak are not insignificant. The reality is that the coronavirus family, which gave rise to SARS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, COVID-19, and more, are very prevalent in the wild. There are different species of animals, but particularly bats, that have a natural propensity towards the infection by this particular group of viruses. They exist in the wild, but don't die from it. That means that there's always some sort of reservoir of the disease in some form in nature. Because of the nature of viruses, they will mutate and change. These changes are more often than not deleterious, meaning they either kill the animal or do not help the virus. In some rare cases, you will find that the virus goes from infecting one species, such as bats or birds, to then infecting pigs, and because pigs are at least somewhat similar to humans, mutations there eventually lead to being able to infect a human host. It's just two small steps, but two steps that we see on a semi-regular basis. SARS occurred in the early 2000s, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome around 2012, and COVID-19 about 2020. You see how about every 10 years we get an outbreak. This now leads us to the next point of contention, and the final point to be made here. Other than the fact that the virus spreads in a particular way in people, that the way it spreads between people is important, and that we are not going to get rid of it anytime soon, there needs to be a way to control it, and that is vaccines. Knowing that the coronavirus family poses a not insignificant threat based on the past experience with it, there has been a lot of research into coronavirus, but it's a complex disease. It's why we don't have a cure to the common cold. It's why we have to have a new vaccine for the influenza virus every year. Thankfully, because of this research, we know a lot about what's happening with it. And this is one reason why the vaccines have been developed so quickly. We say quick development, not rushed development. The distinction is important. It was quick because we knew enough about the pathogen to be able to take action, that we have the equipment and knowledge to work towards that vaccine very quickly. That alone wouldn't be enough, except that governments were effectively throwing money at this problem like it was raining money. Then you have to consider just how many people were volunteering for clinical trials. In most cases, it's extremely hard to recruit people, and depending on where you live, different jurisdictions have different rules regarding rewarding people for volunteering for clinical trials, because so many people volunteered so quickly that there was so much money available to develop early vaccines that could be tested, and we knew so much about what we were trying to target, the vaccines were available extremely quickly. Then you need to consider the fact that because COVID-19 has spread so very quickly, we knew what the results were of any attempts to either vaccinate or not vaccinate, clinical trials, different medications, and so on, very quickly, whether for good or bad reasons. This is why we describe it as a quick turnaround time rather than a rushed project. Under normal circumstances, you would be waiting years to see the kind of numbers and statistics we are seeing with the vaccines for COVID-19. The numbers were simply in the favor of getting these vaccines to market that much sooner. It's not a good thing necessarily, but it is what it is, and the argument that it was rushed doesn't actually stack up to the knowledge that we have about the vaccine's development. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.